Saagar Enjeti from Breaking Points is the literal embodiment of Mr. Mackey from South Park when it comes to talking about drugs and their impact on society. And I always say that if someone sounds like Mr. Mackey when you're talking about drugs and their impact on society, the more that you don't have to listen to or respect their opinion. With that being said, hit the intro, eh? What the fuck is going on, YouTube? It's Ashcon, aka Dropped Out Beats, back again with another Addiction Neuroscientist Reacts video. For those just tuning into the channel, please hit the subscribe because we're trying to get those numbers up, you know what I'm saying? Today we're going to be reacting to Saagar Enjeti from Breaking Points, talking about how Trump is in favor of legal cannabis recreation in Florida. If you're not aware, Saagar absolutely hates weed for some reason, and it is honestly one of my biggest problems with Saagar, not to mention all of his other bad opinions, but this channel is about drug addiction and drug use, and so one of my biggest issues with Saagar is that he moralizes drug use. And so Saagar,
open your ears, jackass! Jackass! Jackass!
You moralize drug use by saying all of the drugs you don't use are morally bad and all of the drugs that you do use are morally good. The drugs that Saagar uses are caffeine, alcohol, and nicotine. And he loves nicotine so much. Let me make this big for a second. He has 2 videos talking about how Democrats are trying to ban smokeless tobacco or something. I remember starting to watch these videos and just being like, Saagar, this is just you crying about the regulations surrounding smokeless tobacco and possible advertisement and the sale of smokeless tobacco, but you think that cannabis should be illegal. And so, with that being said, I'm going to make my big handsome face small, and we're gonna make Saagar's ugly head big and get into it.
Let's go to the next part. This is a personal one, very, very personal for me. Let's go and put this up there on the screen. Speaking of Trump supporting things in the state of Florida, Trump is now in support of the recreational, quote-unquote, recreational marijuana initiative in Florida. Let me read entirely. As everyone knows, I was and will be again the most respected law and order president in U.S. history. We will take our streets back by being tough on crime, blah, blah, blah. Like in Florida, like so many other states that have already given their approval, personal amounts of marijuana will be legalized for adults with Amendment 3. Whether people like it or not, this will happen through the approval of voters. So it should be done correctly. We need the state legislature to responsibly create laws that prohibit the use of it in public spaces so we do not smell marijuana everywhere we go, like we do in many of the Democratic-run cities. True. At the same time, someone should not be criminal in Florida when this is legal in so many other states. We do not need to ruin lives and waste taxpayer dollars arresting adults with personal amounts of it on them, and no one should grieve a loved one because they died from fentanyl-laced marijuana.
Fentanyl-laced marijuana doesn't exist, and if it did exist and legalizing cannabis stopped people from dying of fentanyl-laced marijuana, you should be in favor of it, dumbass.
We will make America safe again. So Trump is now fully in support of Amendment 3. And it's funny because a lot of the criticism from the pro-life side of Trump on these amendments and all that applies exactly to this one. This is not, let me be very clear, Amendment 3 is not decriminalization. It is straight up commercial legalization of pot.
Good. It should be straight up commercial legalization of fucking pot. I hate when people call it pot. Anytime someone says pot, I want to take a flower pot and just put it over their head and be like, you're a pothead now.
In the same way that you see in Denver and everywhere else, which will lead to the massive proliferation of weed stores literally everywhere, the
Who gives a shit?
Putrid smell of marijuana. You can say whatever you want.
It smells like a skunk. How can you decide if it's weed or a skunk? I mean, it's probably weed, but you, Saagar?
Want about, oh, well, we need to prohibit public space. It's not going to happen because the commercial incentive is way too strong. My friend Charles Lehman wrote a great Wall Street Journal.
It's not a great Wall Street Journal article. I wasn't able to read it. You have to pay to go read it. I started looking into Charles Lehman, and he's just an anti-intellectual drug hack like Saagar, who's a conservative who thinks drugs should be illegal. I mean, there is nothing interesting that these people have to say. So let's let Saagar get into his nonsense.
Op-ed just this morning about the problems with widespread legalization with no curbs on commercialization. Excuse me. With no.
That was Saagar when he tried to hit the blunt the one time. Let me make myself big so we can really get this reaction. He was like, wait, I'm gonna go throw up now. Weed's so bad. Can't stand this guy.
No curbs on commercialization, or on the increased percentage of THC.
And you can tell how riled up he is too. He can't even like get his words out properly.
In products, no regulation, literally whatsoever. And by the time people even try and get around to doing that, a lot of the damage is already done.
So let's hear what he says. Or rather, what Charles Lehman says the damage is done, but this is basically Saagar's nonsense too, you know what I mean?
In terms of traffic fatalities, rising addiction, problems with children, schizophrenic breaks, and increased amounts of crime. So that's all I would say on the subject, but Trump clearly has, quote, gone woke on the issue.
Okay, so I'm going to pause right there, make myself big, and we're going to go through this list of BS that Saagar has listed. The only reasonable thing that Saagar listed that I can respond to and provide a small amount of credence to is traffic fatalities or motor vehicle crashes in general. So let's kind of look into this. All of my references will be down in the description below. Please hit the like while we're at it. You know what I'm saying?
Make some fucking noise!
In the comments if you think Saagar is an absolute moron because he is an anti-intellectual hack. Yeah, so let's get into this. This is from a study out of the Journal of Studies of Alcohol and Drugs in 2022. And so I'm just going to read you the blurb of the results from this. It says, legalization of the recreational use of marijuana. Let me actually make this big. Legalization of the recreational use of marijuana was associated with a 6.5% increase in injury crash rates and a 2.3% increase in fatal crash rates. But the subsequent onset of retail marijuana sales did not elicit additional substantial changes. Thus, the combined effect of legalization and retail sales was a 5% increase in injury crash rates and a 4.1% increase in fatal crash rates. Across states, the effects on injury crash rates range from 7% decrease to an 18% increase. The effects on fatal crash rates range from a 10% decrease to a 4% increase. So basically what that tells you is that they don't really know if marijuana legalization leads to an increase in motor vehicle crashes. Because in one state, right when they legalize, we see an increase in the amount of car accidents. But then as legalization continues to function, we don't see, a subsequent increase, a continued increase in the amount of car accidents. Now, I'm also not sure if that little bump that might happen when we first legalize cannabis goes back down to the average that it was before after a few years, because people understand what cannabis can do to them, right? So like, for example, if we legalize cannabis federally and all states it's legal, and people are going to get the idea like, hey, I've never used cannabis, now I can go legally use it, I'm going to try it. I've literally heard this from people who have never smoked or done an edible or anything. You know what I'm saying? I've heard this anecdotally from people. So there might be an increase in the number of first-time users trying cannabis. Those people are not going to know how cannabis affects them, and then they might get behind the wheel thinking they're safe, and then they have poor decision making and they're not able to drive their car properly. But just like, You don't know how alcohol is going to affect you until you start drinking, right? That's the same thing. And so I wouldn't recommend someone who just turned 21, has never drank before, goes to the bar, drinks, a pint of beer, which is technically one beer, but it's going to be 16 ounces, drinks a pint of beer, or is a pint more than that? And then, I don't know, somebody correct me in the comments. I'm not looking this bullshit up right now. I know when I go to the bar, I get a 16-ounce beer, which is 4 ounces more than a 12-ounce beer, which is usually in a can or a bottle that you buy at a grocery store, right? So you get a little bit more buzzed off of one, and then a little bit more buzzed off of two, you know what I'm saying? And so you got to keep that in mind when you're using substances. The dose is really going to impact your behavioral effects, especially if you've never used the drug. If you've never used a drug before, you have no business getting behind the wheel. I mean, it should go without saying that someone who's never drank alcohol doesn't really need to drive after their first drink. Someone who's never smoked doesn't need to drive after their first smoke session. Someone who's never popped a pill doesn't need to drive after the first pill they've popped, whether it was prescription or not. It shouldn't be that difficult. So let's keep looking into this. So, like I said, all references will be linked down below, but so this is from the American surgeon, I guess, Kruse and fellow researchers, but it's graphs looking at the percentage of testing positive for THC in motor vehicle collisions and the percentage of patients positive for ethanol alcohol in motor vehicle collisions. And so we do actually see some increase in the number of motor vehicle collisions correlating, not causation, right? It's correlation. We see it correlating to cannabis legalization. Even if that is the case, it is not reasonable to make cannabis continue to be illegal and put people in jail for buying and selling cannabis. It's not reasonable anymore, Saagar. We have to stop this. You have to shut up. We don't care what you have to say anymore. You don't have anything interesting to say. You moralize your drug use. You probably get behind the wheel after you go to the bar and have a drink or two. I mean, maybe you live in DC, so you don't have to drive, but bro, stop being a fucking hypocrite. Now, we're going to go down the list, like I said. Let's look at the idea that, marijuana use increases the rates of addiction. This is kind of a rebrand, in my opinion, of the whole, gateway drug theory, that if you use weed, you're going to start using harder substances. Okay, Saagar and anyone else that's listening that even remotely agrees with Saagar, there's no such thing as hard drugs. Comment down below what your definition of a hard drug is. Now listen to what I'm saying. I am not saying comment down below a list of hard drugs or a list of drugs that you think are hard drugs. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I want you to give me an operational definition for the hard in the phrase hard drugs. What does that mean? That the drugs are hard to quit? By that definition, every addictive substance would be a hard drug, whether it's cannabis, alcohol, cocaine, methamphetamine, it doesn't matter. Are we referring to hard as in it's hard on your body? Well, then alcohol is definitely a hard drug because it is very hard on your liver. It's very hard on your brain. It dehydrates you. Go look at the effects of chronic alcohol use disorder. It's really bad. Cannabis, I don't know what evidence we have to suggest that cannabis is super hard on your body. I think the psychiatry community, which we'll get into, they overblow the effects of cannabis just because the pharmaceutical companies don't totally want cannabis to be legal, and the psychiatrists work with the pharmaceutical companies pretty tightly. But so let's read this little blurb from, this is the National Bureau of Economics. This is from a research paper from them, and you might be hearing the the title National Bureau of Economics and think this is actually something related to our government. It's not. It's actually just a private nonprofit that does research. And so they say recreational marijuana laws, which legalize the possession of small quantities of marijuana and recreational use, have been adopted by 18 states. Okay. Opponents argue that recreational marijuana-induced increases in marijuana consumption will serve as a gateway to harder drug use and crime, like we were just discussing. They go on to say that our analyses show that recreational marijuana laws increase adult marijuana use, as we were talking about earlier. People are going to go try cannabis that have never done it before just because it's legal and they can legally use it now. And they can safely use it, right? Like, you can go buy it safely. There's no fentanyl-laced weed, and you can go home and get high and watch Dune Part 2. Highly recommend. Maybe that movie's not good for a first-time high. You might be too paranoid. Maybe, you know, keep it funny or something, but like, I don't know. I've just been into Dune, so fuck it, whatever. Increase adult marijuana use and reduce drug-related arrests over an average post-legalization window of 3 to 4 years. There is little evidence to suggest that recreational marijuana laws induced increases in marijuana consumption, encourage the use of harder substances or violent criminal activity, and there's some evidence that recreational marijuana laws may aid in reducing opioid-related mortality. What does that mean? That means that there's evidence that in states that have legalized recreational cannabis, they show a decrease in the amount of opioid-related overdoses. Is that not one of the things we are trying to stop in this country right now? Don't we have a so-called opioid epidemic? We have an opioid epidemic, and Saagar is out here talking about how cannabis, which we have no evidence that you can overdose on, is out here telling you that you shouldn't smoke it because it's too dangerous. Give me a fucking break, Saagar. Give me a fucking break, man. Stop talking about this. You are not qualified to talk about this. And then when I say you're not qualified, you're going to say, oh, I'm arguing from authority. And it's like, yeah, I am arguing from authority. I spent how many years learning about drugs, and like even my drug opinions have shifted. Like, I used to think like, oh, we should legalize cannabis but keep all the other drugs illegal. And then I was like, oh, we should legalize psychedelics and keep all the other drugs illegal. And now I'm just like, that's hypocritical. We need to legalize all the drugs. I'm self-aware enough to see my development. Saagar, it's time for you to move on. So with that being said, we'll move on. On his next list of things after traffic fatalities was rising addiction, and we kind of already got that we don't really see rising addiction. Maybe we see an increase in marijuana consumption, which there may be a compensatory increase in cannabis use disorder, but like cannabis use disorder and its effect on public health, I would suspect is the risk and the benefit of legalizing. That's worth the legalization risk. The subject or the increase in cannabis use disorder, especially if we see a decrease in alcohol use disorder, opioid use disorder, methamphetamine use disorder. All of those three use disorders are worse on your body than cannabis use disorder. So the next thing Saagar lists is problems with children. I don't even know what that means. I can't even begin to research that because Saagar just says there's problems with the children, which is what all fucking Republicans cite as a reason of the dangers of drugs. Most Republicans give their kids soda, which contains a drug, caffeine. I don't want to hear it. The moralizing of drug use, it's my biggest pet peeve in life. I can't handle it. Just saying problems with children is a result of cannabis legalization is utter nonsense. And it is further indicative that Saagar is an anti-intellectual hack who is the human embodiment of Mr. Mackey when it comes to this drug talk. Now we'll go to the next point on his list, which I can actually research. The number of schizophrenic breaks as a result of cannabis legalization. So let me start out by saying that I have a serious issue with how we talk about cannabis use leading to any form of psychosis, schizophrenia, or anything else. So just to let you guys know, I do not work as an addiction neuroscientist researcher anymore. I'm actually a medical writer, and my job is to recognize bias, and I work with the top psychiatrists in the country. And we don't agree on a lot of things, quite frankly. But when it comes to the schizophrenic breaks and cannabis use, there is no good neurobiological mechanism of action to account for how cannabis may lead to a schizophrenic break. Now, what do I mean by this? If you just go on YouTube and look up, kind of the standard disease models of addiction, they talk about how all drugs of addiction increase dopamine, and dopamine, hyperactive dopamine being too much dopamine, is actually one of the prevailing theories for the development of schizophrenia. There's a whole host of issues I'm not going to get into, or neurobiological explanations for schizophrenia I'm not going to get into in this video. But there are so many different neurotransmitter systems implicated in schizophrenia that are not just dopamine. The hyperactive dopamine is definitely there, but we also have cholinergic effects of schizophrenia. We have serotonergic effects of schizophrenia. We have adrenergic effects of schizophrenia. And so if you go back and watch my Fergie reaction video where I lay out how methamphetamine and amphetamines in general can cause psychosis. There's a specific neurobiological mechanism of action that we know occurs that leads to amphetamine-induced psychosis, which causes delusions, hallucinations, paranoia, the whole 9 yards. When it comes to the mechanism of action for cannabis-induced psychosis, we really don't have any good evidence for it. Now, what do I mean? I mean that when researchers, and it's really not the neuroscience community, I started to look into it, and unfortunately I found one neuroscientist that was commenting in the news, and she was supporting it, but her family had a history of schizophrenia, and she was saying that her son developed schizophrenia after smoking weed. And I'm like, that's disingenuous, because you already told us that your family had a history of smoking weed, or a history of schizophrenia. And so if you have a history of schizophrenia and then smoke weed and it unmasks your schizophrenia, on no planet should we say that, cannabis caused your schizophrenia. That's just not how this works. And so please go back, watch the Fergie reaction to further learn about the neuroscience behind drug-induced psychosis. Not cannabis-induced psychosis, but amphetamine-induced psychosis. And so lastly, we'll get into, we'll kind of finish the schizophrenic break section out with a little blurb from Cannabis and Psychosis, a critical overview of the relationship by Charles Sir and Carl Hart. I always love me some Carl Hart, so let's see what Carl has to say about this. Zoom in here for you guys. Is the association between cannabis... Let me make this big. Is the association between cannabis use and psychosis strong enough to warrant our attention? It could be argued that it is not. For example, the vast majority of cannabis users will never receive a diagnosis of a psychotic disorder, but psychotic disorders are rare, and we should remember that over 90% of cigarette smokers do not develop lung cancer, and over 90% of women who consume 2 or more drinks per day during pregnancy will produce normal-appearing offspring, which is pretty interesting. What is important in each of these cases is the risk ratios, which are approximately 10 to 1 relative to abstainers. The apparent relative risk for psychosis among users of cannabis has been reported to be about 2 to 1, and for heavy users as high as 6 to 1. In addition, it has often been reported that cannabis users have earlier onset of first episode psychosis or schizophrenia. Although not as strong as the relationship for tobacco and lung cancer or for maternal alcohol and birth defects, the association is strong enough to warrant further efforts to understand it. From a public health perspective, however, the potential contribution of cannabis use to schizophrenia appears to be quite small. A recent model of the global burden of disease estimated that the number of disability-adjusted life years lost due to the potential contribution of regular cannabis use or dependence to schizophrenia represented about 0.35% of the total disability. Okay, now let's shift over here so we can get some further criticism of this idea. So they say here, we are on solid ground. As described in the introduction, many studies from many populations over many years have reported that cannabis users have higher than average rates of schizophrenia. Again, this consistency does not favor either hypothesis, meaning either hypothesis being that cannabis does or does not cause schizophrenia. Specificity. By specificity, we mean to ask whether cannabis has a special relationship to the incidence of psychosis. We can ask the question in two ways. One, is the use of other substances also associated with psychotic illness? And two, do cannabis users also have higher than average rates of other psychiatric disorders? There's reason to question the causal hypothesis from both of these perspectives. First, it has long been known that schizophrenia is associated with higher rates of heavy tobacco smoking, and recent evidence continues to support this link. We actually know, or rather we actually have a pretty good idea that the reason that people with schizophrenia smoke is because of the nicotinic effects. It's actually self-medicating. And so a lot of people with schizophrenia use nicotine and smoke because it does actually decrease some of their symptoms is what they actually find. Whether that's worth the risk, I don't know. Indeed, the kinds of evidence linking psychotic illness and schizophrenia to the use of these two substances are remarkably similar, as have been the arguments about causality. Also, cannabis users are more likely to smoke tobacco, and tobacco smokers are more likely to use cannabis, meaning that separating these two relationships is difficult. Beyond that, people with psychosis tend to use alcohol heavily and often have higher rates of stimulant and opioid use. It may be that cannabis use is more common than the use of other illicit drugs among schizophrenic populations, but this is perhaps due to the fact that cannabis is the most widely used illicit drug in the population. In many cases, alcohol use disorders is found about as frequently as cannabis use disorder. All of this is to say that Saagar's fear-mongering and propaganda and sounding like Mr. Mackey about cannabis and other drugs is absolutely unacceptable. And if you agree with me, please hit the like.
Make some fucking noise!
In the comments down below, and hit the subscribe to join the channel. We're trying to do big things over here. We a bunch of beautiful degenerates. I would go look at the comment section on Breaking Point's video and show you guys, but it's so just people calling Saagar out because he's so ridiculous. So as you can imagine, because I mean, fear-mongering about cannabis at this point is totally unacceptable. We have serious problems in this country to deal with, and cannabis legalization could quite frankly help some of those serious problems by generating tax money. As someone who I lost my cousin in a car accident, and he was one of the closest people to me in my life. He's the closest thing I had to a twin brother, and I would never say don't legalize cannabis because I lost someone to a car accident. That's fucking ridiculous. The same way I wouldn't say make alcohol illegal because someone killed my cousin in a drunk driving accident. I think that everyone should be tasked with the burden of using drugs responsibly. And if we don't step up our education as to what that means and tell people like Saagar Enjeti to shut the fuck up, we're going to start walking backwards. That being said, hit the like, subscribe. I appreciate all you beautiful degenerates. Peace out.
We would learn together and experience together how to reach the 5 levels of consciousness, which are available to a species like ours.
Drop out, drop out, drop out.